Our underreported story segment tonight, the Women's March is in big trouble after their leaders were caught cozying up to anti-Semitic and homophobic hate preacher Louis Farrakhan. The Women's March organization is trying to do damage control. They've denied that they are homophobic or anti-Semitic, but they won't even bring themselves to actually denounce Farrakhan by name. So how can the left prop up the Women's March as a voice for women when the Women's March applauds for a man who calls Jews evil and says white people should die and wants to behead gay people? With me now from the Daily Caller, Julia Nista. Julia, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Liz.
All right, Julia, talk to me about this because I don't quite understand why the Women's March hasn't disavowed Farrakhan by name. How hard is that to say we disavow this man and his hatred and his bigotry and his racism?
Well, one of the things and one of the aspects I think that it's important to note here is that Tamika Mallory, one of the leaders for the Women's March, attended a February 25th Nation of Islam speech in which Louis Farrakhan called her out by name, and she responded by applauding him. So they have these ties with him from the leadership on down. And so it's kind of hard to separate that type of a tie with the leadership from a person who is so vitriolic out in the open and in the public. And one of the things I don't understand is why they aren't saying this, why they aren't saying anything kind of distancing themselves from him, because he said things like Jews are powerful, they're enemies, he's called them satanic, and so it should be very easy for them to distance themselves, but they've not. And in their response, when they wrote a letter and they released it on Twitter, they did not completely disavow him. They said his statements did not align with the Women's March, but they did not apologize for any kind of relationship that they have with him.
No, and I want to show this on the screen. This is from Tamika Mallory. She's the co-chair, I think, of the Women's March, co-chair, co-organizer. I'm not sure her preferred title, but she's associated in the upper echelons of the Women's March. She tweeted this. She said, "This is a thread. It seems that I am not being clear. I am and always have been against all forms of racism. I'm committed to ending anti-black racism, anti-Semitism, homophobia, and transphobia. This is why I helped create an intersectional movement to bring groups together." Julia, is that an apology?
Absolutely not. And in fact, one of her original tweets was in defense of her attendance and at this particular Nation of Islam speech in which she was applauding him. And then she comes out with these tweets. So it's really important to understand here that they're not apologizing, they're side-skirting. And I think this also goes to show exactly what the Women's March is. They don't really stand for anything. If you look on their website, they talk about community rights, workers' rights, LGBT rights, environmental rights, all of these things that really don't point to any one end goal. So they look at Louis Farrakhan and whoever follows him as a faction to appeal to, and that's not acceptable.
No, I think that's the new definition of the word intersectional, not standing for anything specific. Whatever they feel like day to day, that's their goal, or that's what it means. So you see, here's the thing. You can choose to applaud for Louis Farrakhan. You can go to his speeches, even though he's called white people white devils, called for the death of white people. He's a black supremacist, essentially. He's blamed Jews for 9/11, and he's called Adolf Hitler a very great man. You can either choose to go to voluntarily go to a speech that he's making and applaud for him, or you can choose to fight against racism and fight against anti-Semitism, but you can't have it both ways. And that seems to me what Tamika Mallory is doing in this tweet. She's virtue signaling, and you can't do both. You can't.
You can't, and that is what the point is here. The Women's March is being totally hypocritical in the fact that they think they can bring all of these factions together that just oppose each other. I mean, you cannot certainly stand for values and stand for the rights of certain individuals, especially people who are oppressed or whatever, and then feature someone who is a leader at Louis Farrakhan's speech applauding him. That doesn't make any sense, and that's completely hypocritical of the Women's March to do so.
Right, and it's hypocritical of the Democratic Party and the mainstream media as well, because imagine for 1 second that this were the reverse. Imagine top Republican leaders attended a white supremacist conference, a speech by David Duke or Richard Spencer. Imagine for 1 second the outcry. Every single Republican, not only elected official, but leaders of the party, pundits, anyone who's ever voted for a Republican would be called to condemn that individual immediately or forever be associated with their bigotry and hatred and racism. Yet we don't see that. The only people calling out the Women's March, the only people calling out the Democratic elected officials, those 21 members of Congress, are conservatives. The Democrats don't seem to care about the association at all.
No, they don't. And you see people like Maxine Waters and Barbara Lee and Keith Ellison who have not publicly disavowed Louis Farrakhan. In fact, some of them have actually met with Louis Farrakhan in the past, and they haven't said anything about that now. They're not disavowing him. And yet at the same time, when Trump was running for president in 2016, they were calling, screaming for him to disavow David Duke, which he did. And yet you don't see that kind of reaction from Democrats when it comes to Louis Farrakhan. And so that seems to me as well another point of hypocrisy here. Again, with the Women's March leaders and again with Democrat leaders, you just don't see that type of reaction, and they should be reacting in a way that just completely distances themselves from a person like Louis Farrakhan.
Right. Well, it goes back to the you can't have it both ways. You can't pretend to be outraged about racism on the right, far right, on the fringe. You can't pretend to be outraged about white supremacism and white supremacy and not be outraged when it comes from the left, not be outraged when it's black supremacy or anti-Semitism or homophobia. You either condemn all racists or you don't get to pretend to be outraged when it comes from your political opponents. You can't have it both ways. I think what the Women's March is displaying is what we call textbook hypocrisy, and it's good for them to expose the truth. We knew it all along, but now everyone does. Julia, thanks for coming on the show. I appreciate